Great. Thank you again for having me, and to KOHLER as well. It's quite a distinguished group of people to be speaking amongst. I feel very privileged to be up here. I am currently in the midst of opening a hotel. It is my first. I am very novice to the space. I actually have spent my entire career building technology. So if the beer didn't already give it away, they put the technologist up first. So I'll breeze through it rather quickly, but I was sort of there at the advent of social media, of interactive, for those of you who remember the days of Flash. I was an early employee at a company called FreshBooks, where I got to learn what it meant to run a software company. Did some backpacking, I encourage you all. And then when design became something that was at the forefront of technology because there was just so much of it, Jet Cooper was born, and Jet Cooper became one of Canada's top software design companies. We sold that to Shopify, which I'm sure many of you know. There I got to open a research lab on the future of retail, so intersecting physical space with software. That was a lot of fun. And today, I actually run two companies. One is called Delphia. We are allowing people to use their data to invest in the stock market without actually having to require any money, which is a fairly novel use of data. And the second piece is that we are opening a hotel, or this is a separate company rather, but I am opening a hotel that is very much underpinned by the use of software and technology. So I have this sort of admission to start with, which is that I'm actually a laggard when it comes to adopting technology. And I think it's an important distinction because I think that we are very enamored and amused by technology in terms of the things we see in movies and the innovations we read about in the news. But whether we choose to admit it or not, the adoption curve really does trail quite a bit behind. And I'm used to speaking on how that impacts our identity, but it certainly impacts the way we structure business operations as well. That is to say, we can sort of peer out over the horizon, but in a whole separate process, we need to think about what the world might be ready for now, because ultimately, all technology introduces some amount of friction. So this is my friend Steve Mann, and this is sort of, I would say, what happens if you make your life about the very cutting edge of technology. Steve was working with the genesis, I guess you could say, for what was Google, eventually Google Glass, but doing so in the 1980s. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is our first hotel, which is a 24-room boutique hotel where we're going to have average folks who want to come in and have a delightful experience. And so this ultimately, you have to hold the tension between these two things and decide, what is your relationship going to be to technology in this particular moment with this particular venture? And I think that's a really important question that doesn't have the same answer every time. And so as you're endeavoring in your own respective business affairs, I would say that identifying what the relationship is going to be is pretty important. So just a few ground rules I'd like to put forward as you think about the adoption of technology within your companies or your ventures. One is to sort of expect iteration and failure. And the key thing that we noticed when building a hotel was that there are a lot of different hotel and hospitality companies right now that are trying to assert the future, if you will, and doing so in a way that is I'll just say aggressive. It has a very specific prescriptive view of what that future might look like. And I think there's a bit of a hope that people will just sort of gracefully walk into that. And in my experience, that really hasn't been how technology gets adopted. It's actually mostly failure on the road to adoption. It's a road of a lot of assumptions around how the world will behave, and then a series of validations that you have to go through where you discover which of those assumptions were correct and which were not. So the lean startup movement took hold in the software sector probably around 2008. For those that aren't familiar with it, this is the sort of basic premise. It starts with the fact that we all have wonderful ideas around technology and how it'll work. You can replace code with whatever the output or throughput is in your organization. It actually wasn't born in software. I'll explain that in a minute. But ultimately, the whole process here is about discovering through data what did and did not work. And that seems like it has a lot of application to software where you can change lines of code quite readily, but it seems very incongruent with something like hotel construction, which is a very large waterfall process that we go through. And so it would seem like a lean approach to technology in that environment wouldn't really make a ton of sense. But in actuality, lean wasn't born out of the software industry. Lean as a methodology was born out of the automobile industry. And it was something that Toyota actually coined. And it was really just about minimizing waste. And Toyota's sort of big revelation was that we should build into our production, or so we should build our production rather in accordance with sales actuals as opposed to sales projections. So prior to that, sales projections really drove how many cars needed to be built. Whereas they looked at it and said, well, actually, it should be a function of actuals. We should see what the market truly wants, see how the data is speaking to us, and then adjust our processes accordingly. And I think this is an approach that can be adopted quite readily by the hospitality industry with some intention. The second sort of ground rule here is that, as I mentioned earlier, people are incredibly averse to change, even those of us on the cutting edge of technological adoption. And I think you just have to assume as much. And so just by a show of hands here, for those who stayed in hotels lately, how many had an iPad in the room in one of their recent stays? Great, now just keep your hands high for 1 sec. How many of you actually picked up and made use of the iPad? So about half went down or so. And so it's interesting, right? Like we can put an iPad into a hotel room. It can be loaded with all kinds of things. But if you give me a bit of an escape hatch and you allow me to do the processes that I want to do through other avenues that are more familiar, I'm probably going to lean in that direction because really I'm not always in the mood for the extra mental cycles of learning something new. And so you've got to really think critically around how you're going to introduce the adoption into the process with the technology. So in the Annex, we made a very big, bold decision out of the gate. We treat the iPad actually as your primary media device. That is to say, it's your television at the same time. And also, we don't have a phone in the room. So if you're going to communicate with us, you're going to do so through Facebook Messenger or text or things of this nature. We do have a phone number, so I don't want anyone to hit the panic button. But my point here is we've sort of decided that like in certain moments where you want to go to something naturally, we don't want to give you an out. We want to use that as an opportunity to invite you into a new experience. And hopefully, when you've gained a little bit of comfort picking up the iPad, there is something to be said for what else might be in that experience for you, what other applications, what other things we have going. I actually think Virgin has done a pretty good job of this, but I do want to caution one thing, which is the tendency to, I guess I'll say, over-featureize things. I think Virgin holds this line quite well, but I think we often, the answer to technological adoption for a lot of people is, if we pack more in, there'll just be more things to do in there, and so there'll be more reasons to pick it up. And that can be sometimes true, but there's a whole graveyard of software technology companies that tried this, and it didn't actually produce the desired results. So in this case, Path was a social network designed for mobile from one of the early Facebook employees that came out with beautiful design but never got off the ground. In every way, it was better than Facebook at the time it came out, but never got off the ground despite all its robust design and features. And the reason is because of these mental cycles. People, generally speaking, if they can expend less mental energy to do something, they will. And it was not sufficiently more compelling to go up the learning curve to use something like Path. And this is why people really actually resort to text message quite a bit too, despite huge advents in different applications that try to build chat within them, is that you can text, believe it or not, while driving. And I'm not recommending it, but that's why you're able to do it, because it's on autopilot. It's a mental cycle that people do on autopilot. And so you really have to concern yourselves with What is the extra effort I'm asking here of people? So again, I want to talk about virtuous cycles because this is another important concept. I think this will show up in other places too, but the notion of feedback loops. If you're going to introduce someone to a new experience and you're going to be honest, if you're going to put a little bit of friction in front of them, it's important that those feedback loops are tight and they are little virtuous circles that people go, oh, I feel confident in that task and I can do that again on my own accord. And so keeping that in mind when you're thinking about all the activities that I would normally go through inside of a guest experience, whether that's, well, I mean, you can see them here, but calling ahead or ordering a taxi or checking into my room, each of these are the basic activities that I need to do with every guest experience. And right now, this is the quickest, easiest way for me to get those done. And so even if we were to take all of these and put them into a beautifully woven aggregate experience, it's not a foregone conclusion that people would make use of that. These are sort of individually the simple answers to these questions. And so as you think about your technology and what it's trying to accomplish, what is it a simple answer to? What is the one sort of process that you're making so seamless, so easy, so simple that people can feel confident at the end of it and get a little feedback loop that says, you could do this again? So just to kind of actually maybe draw some examples here. Our approach to surfacing the neighborhood at the Annex is actually about making use of Google Maps in a way that, which is a technology everybody's familiar with, making use of Google Maps in a way that we've curated different layers that you can one-click add to a Google Maps experience. Now this might seem intuitive, but we just assume that people want to go to Google Maps when they're trying to navigate how to get somewhere or when they're trying to decide where they want to go eat. And so rather than try to pull them into a unique software app experience that the Annex has created, what we're saying is, go to the experience you're already used to, we've layered something on top. And so this is a very reasonable answer to how to give people technology in small doses. It doesn't need to always be a big grandiose endeavor. So I think I've mentioned this at this point, but the world is incredibly overwhelming, even for myself. I find that even working in the technology sector, it's very difficult to stay abreast of all the different domain spaces. And so simplifying these mental processes and giving people back the bandwidth they're looking for is important. And so this actually reminds me a lot of Clay Christensen's work, for those who aren't familiar, which is around jobs to be done. And so Clay Christensen looked at everything through the lens of what is the person or the individual trying to accomplish here? And how can I actually just enable that rather than making the means the end unto itself? There was an interesting sort of example around, actually I don't think I have time for it, I just saw the clock, so maybe I'll punt on the example. But the jobs to be done framework is actually very useful when you're trying to decide why your technology needs to exist at all. As you're looking at the consumer and saying, they're just trying to get to a restaurant, they're just trying to check the weather, they're just trying to swap a SIM card or what have you, how can I facilitate that and make that easier rather than take them on a giant detour where the means starts to look like the end unto itself? We do this with our operations as well. So we think very critically around, I mean, these are the three big buckets really that we think our staff are doing. They're completing tasks, they're capturing transactions, and they're assisting the guest. And we looked at this and said, okay, well, 1 and 2 are fairly monotonous. They're what we call low-value interactions with the guest. I may be standing at the front desk trying to get a key card programmed or ensuring my folio is accurate or what have you. How can we make those as seamless and automated as possible so that the cycles of our staff can be freed up for the high-value activities, which is essentially assisting the guest? And so we made a very big call out of the gate in terms of how we chose our technology and how we bolted on from there, that essentially was going to prioritize the use of APIs. And for those that aren't familiar, APIs are application programming interfaces. They allow us to connect all kinds of softwares. So we can seamlessly trigger events from one software to another automatically as things happen. And what this allows us to do is essentially remove all the low-value interactions and focus on more high-value ones, which in our world looks like no front desk and looks like staff who are constantly commingling with guests, who are actually sometimes even sitting around with them and having coffee with them, etc. So I would just encourage that as a way of thinking, like, what are the things that are driving the experience for the people who you are working with? And lastly, and I know I'm at time, apologies. Lastly, I think saying no is probably the most skillful part of any technologist's job. Essentially, users or people can only experience one feature at a time. You could put 100 in there, but I can't get exposure to them all at once. I really only get to interact with one at a time. And so it's on you to decide, what is the most important thing for me to interact with when I interact with your technology? And how can you get that to me first and as quickly as possible? I will skip these. Ultimately, I'll remind everyone that the things you are building, the technology that you're building, it's actually just in service of a job to be done. It's not the end unto itself. Thank you.